and welcome everyone. Good to see such happy faces for the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation. I see you're taking it quite seriously. Welcome to all of you. A special welcome to our special guests, Dr. Indu Bhushan, CEO, Ayushman Bharat, Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO, Niti Aayog, Dr. Renu Swaroop, Secretary, Department of Biotechnology, Professor K. Vijay Raghavan, I need my glasses, age, Principal Scientific Advisor, Dr. Balram Bhargav, Director General, Indian Council of Medical Research, Dr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Professor Gagandeep Kaur Kang, Executive Director, Translational Health, Science and Technology Institute, and Mr. Shakti Sinha, Director, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And of course, the speaker of the day, Dr. Siddharth Mukherjee. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to all of you. On behalf of Deepika Padukone, founder of the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation, and the foundation's trustees, Anna Chandy, Dr. Shyam Bhatt, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, Dr. Murli Doraiswamy, and Anisha Padukone, the director, it is my privilege and my pleasure to warmly welcome you all this evening to the inaugural Live, Love, Laugh, a lecture series with Deepika Padukone, presented by the Foundation, with oncologist and author, Dr. Mukherjee. We're really delighted that all of you could make it today. I'm sure we're set for an interesting evening, filled with invigorating insights and discussions, given quite the eclectic mix of people here today. My name is Kaveri Bamza, and I will be your host for the day. May I remind you, please, because this has to be reminded in Delhi, to place your phones on silent mode to avoid disrupting the proceedings. We would like to start by presenting a token of our appreciation to some of our special guests here today. May I invite Deepika, whom I'm sure you don't know, but you can still applaud for her. To present a bouquet to Dr. Indu Bhushan. May we have Dr. Bhushan on stage? Mr. Amitabh Kant, who is here, I'm sure, in between 1,000 other meetings in 1,000 other cities. Thank you for being here. I think we can applaud a little more. Thank you. Deepika's working very hard. Dr. Renu Swaroop. You're going to get quite a workout today with your arms. Professor Vijay Raghavan. Is he here today? No. Dr. Bhargav. Mr. Sanyal. Do we have him here in the house? Oh, yes, we do. And Ms. Gagandeep Kang. The inaugural edition of the Live, Love, Laugh, a lecture series with Deepika Padukone, is a significant step in the journey undertaken by the Foundation. It marks an effort to create a platform to discuss and debate, listen to and learn from some of the world's foremost thinkers and influencers, like Dr. Mukherjee, as they present ideas that are shaping the global mental health narrative. This lecture is the latest in a series of initiatives and collaborations that the Foundation has been able to forge, thanks to all of you. So how did we get here? From that evening back in 2015, when the Foundation was launched at an event at which some of you in this room today were also present. To relive that journey and provide you all with an overview of the Foundation's activities, I'm delighted to call upon Anna Chandy, Chairperson of the Board of Trustees of the Foundation, to the stage. Anna, clearly you're very popular. Over to Anna.
Whew. I always get nervous.
Breathe, Anna, breathe.
She's repeating what I tell her. Dr. Indu Bhushan, CEO Ayushman Bharat, Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO Niti Aayog, Dr. Renu Swarup, Secretary, Department of Biotechnology, Dr. Balram Bhargava, Director General, Indian Council of Medical Research, Professor Vijay Raghavan, Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India, Professor Gagandeep Kang, Executive Director of the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Government of India, Mr. Sakti Sinha, Director, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, our featured speaker at this inaugural lecture, Deepika and my fellow trustees. Ladies and gentlemen, a really very good evening to you all. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share my thoughts with you today to briefly describe the journey that the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation, or TLLF as we call ourselves, has undertaken over these past 4 years. The genesis of the foundation, as some of you may know, was an episode of depression and anxiety that Deepika, our founder, experienced. After her recovery, the desire to save at least one other life and make a difference resulted in the setting up of the foundation in 2015. During her own journey of recovery, Deepika was deeply impacted and recognized the stigma that exists in the area of mental illness. As you are all aware, stigma is a phenomenon that discredits an individual or group when they exhibit attributes, behaviors, and reputations that are socially discrediting. It labels the individual undesirable, and they're excluded from mainstream society. Mental health stigma is deeply entrenched in our society and surfaces as public stigma, self-stigma, and structural stigma. Deepika's action of coming out in public was an action that enveloped these 3 areas at one level, but also transcended beyond. Globally and in our country, stigma associated with mental illness is deeply embedded in our DNA due to transgenerational messaging and therefore needs a sustained, multi-pronged approach. Dr. Bhatt, Dr. Doraiswamy, Deepika, Kiran, and I, as trustees of the foundation, have utilized opportunities to talk about mental health at various platforms because we believe we need to expand the cultural frame of reference with regard to stigma. In fact, Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee's own work in oncology and how the big C, cancer, which was highly stigmatized many decades ago and is no longer so for the most part because large number of patients and advocates rallied to battle the stigmatization and discrimination highlights the need for us and various stakeholders in our country to come together in fighting the stigma associated with mental illness. Over the last 4 years, TLLF has undertaken several impactful initiatives, including mental health awareness programs for school students and teachers. And here are some of the response from the students. For doctors, a sensitization program. We published a research report on perceptions on mental health among the general public. We have also supported and scaled rural mental health programs and launched multimedia public awareness campaigns such as Dobara Pucho and Not Ashamed to help remove stigma and provide hope. Going forward, we will not only expand the scope of our existing initiatives, but also sharpen our focus on research and data gathering so TLLF is able to continually assess impact and identify areas where TLLF can intervene to create a climate that is stigma-free. It's important to point out here the efforts of government and bureaucrats and various stakeholders to decriminalize suicide. I believe this is a powerful action, and I consider this move landmark since it provided people who are suffering and their loved ones an opportunity to feel that they're understood and empathized with. It's a very important marker in the journey to destigmatize mental illness. The current Mental Health Act is also very encouraging. While steps are being taken at many levels by various organizations, we at TLLF are well aware that we are at the start of the journey and there is a long road ahead. We are grateful for your presence here and for your support. We hope each of you would join us in our endeavor to break the stigma and provide hope to each person suffering from stress, anxiety, and depression. One of the most valuable insights about human interaction that I have gained as a practicing therapist for more than 2 decades is that hope is truly one of the greatest gifts we can give to one another. Thank you all for being here.
Truly, hope is one of the greatest gifts we can give to one another. Thank you, Anna, for that overview. Ladies and gentlemen, you may notice that we've placed an information card on your tables that contains a brief history of the Foundation's activities, as well as some information on the reverse of the card. We are very precise, where you can indicate if and how you would like to partner with TLLF. Do take the time to fill the card. It will help us greatly. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a video message from Dr. Harshvardhan, Honorable Minister of Health and Family Welfare, Science and Technology, and Earth Sciences. Unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today as he has had to travel. Please do listen in.
According to WHO, the World Health Organization, health is defined as a state of physical, mental, social, and psychological well-being of an individual. It is not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. The definition itself makes it amply clear that mental health is an important component of the overall health spectrum. I wish to congratulate the Live, Love, and Laugh Foundation, which is mentored so ably by our famous and loved film star Deepika Padukone ji, who has been pursuing the cause of the mentally sick patients for years now and flagging this issue before the Indian society in a professional manner for a long time. I fondly remember that a couple of years back, our beloved Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji, in his Man Ki Baat, had highlighted this issue before the members of the Indian society. He had spoken about the miseries of the mentally sick patients and had also appealed to the professionals related to mental health to do their best for ensuring that no one is deprived of the best possible care in the field of mental health. I am so happy that with the guidance of Deepika Padukone ji, a series of lectures are being started in this country, and the first lecture is going to be delivered by Siddharth Mukherjee ji, who has very ably authored his book Gene, which is an insightful essay on mental illnesses. We know he is a Pulitzer awardee winner and also a leading oncologist. I wish I was in Delhi on this occasion to be part of this function, but for reasons which are absolutely unavoidable, I can't do that. But all my good wishes on behalf of Dr. Harshvardhan and also on behalf of the Health Ministry of India are with all those who are working for the cause of alleviating the sufferings of mentally sick patients, including Deepika ji. Thank you.
We're grateful to Dr. Harshvardhan for his thoughts. I would now like to invite Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, trustee of the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation, and many other things, to the podium to deliver her address. Please. Yes, I think she deserves a very big round of applause.
Thank you, Kaveri. It is an absolute pleasure for me to introduce the inaugural speaker for the Deepika Padukone lecture series, which I think is going to become a very, very important series for bringing focus on this evolving and emerging challenge that the world faces in terms of stress, anxiety, and depression. And I must say that we need to actually give a big round of applause to Deepika for really forging this mission. Siddharth Mukherjee, a dear friend, is a pioneering physician, oncologist, and author who has redefined our public discourse on human health, medicine, and science. A profoundly influential voice in the scientific community, he is best known for his books, The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer, which earned him the 2011 Pulitzer Prize, and more recently, The Gene, An Intimate History, which won international awards and was recognized by the Washington Post and the New York Times as one of the most influential books of 2016. His published works exhibit an outstanding literary skill that has left an indelible mark on our culture, as The Emperor of All Maladies has been adapted into a documentary by filmmaker Ken Burns and was included among Time magazine's 100 best nonfiction books of the past century. Dr. Mukherjee's achievements as a writer and educator build upon his career as a renowned medical scholar. His groundbreaking studies into the composition and behavior of cancer cells have pushed the boundaries of modern medicine. His innovative research signals a paradigm shift in cancer pathology and has enabled the development of treatments that reach beyond current pharmaceutical models towards new biological and cellular therapies. And I'm indeed pleased to announce that he has most recently co-founded Immunil Therapeutics with me and a few others to bring breakthrough cancer therapies to India. Serving as a professor of medicine at Columbia University and as a staff cancer physician at the university's medical center, Dr. Mukherjee generates hope for countless patients and families around the world while revolutionizing our blueprint for healing. He writes for The New Yorker, the New York Times Magazine, and many other publications, and has received numerous awards for his scientific work, and has published his original research and opinions in journals such as Nature, Cell, and the New England Journal of Medicine. He lives in New York City with his famous artist wives, Sarah C., and his two lovely daughters, Leela and Arya. Over to you, Siddharth.
Thank you so much. Kiran is one of my favorite people in the world. So I'm a very informal person. I couldn't even find my socks today. So I will deliver about 20 minutes of a very informal, but I hopefully an important address. And then Deepika and I will have a conversation, which will then open up more broadly to the public. So I will begin by taking my jacket off because I find myself uncomfortable. I'm a scientist. And I will put it here. And talk to you a little bit, quite informally, about very personal things. And hopefully generate some resonances in you. Let me begin with two anecdotes. In the 1950s, Fanny Rosenau, a journalist who was suffering from breast cancer, called up the New York Times and wanted to place an advertisement to create a social support group for women with breast cancer. And she called up the health line. She was on hold for a long time. No one answered. 5 minutes passed, 10 minutes passed. And finally, she was put on the phone with one of the editors of the social pages. And the editor said to Fanny Rosenau, this is 1950s, she said, you know, Miss Rosenau, we can't print the word breast cancer in the New York Times. How about we say this is a social support group of women with chest diseases? So this, I described in my book, I said this is death by euphemism. Because it creates a culture where you become the victim of a disease. That disease is blamed. The blame for the disease is carried by you. In the 1950s, if you spoke to oncologists, as I did, they would remember times when patients with cancer were pushed to the back of to the backs of hospitals. One of the chapters in The Emperor of All Maladies, which is a range around palliative care, is titled from a question that a woman with ovarian cancer asked her doctor. She said, will you throw me out if I don't get better? Would you reject me? Would you, the medical establishment, throw me out of what is the practice of healing if I don't get better, because all you care about is the success of your therapies and not the empathy that you deliver to patients? That's the first anecdote. The second one is a very personal story. My father went to visit my cousin, I've written about it, who was diagnosed with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia and bipolar illness runs in my family. When I began my book, The Gene and Intimate History, the first draft was sent to my family, and I can assure you they were not very happy with it, because it discloses things that were considered dirty laundry, the dirty laundry of mental illness that runs through not just my family but other families. This dirty laundry exists everywhere. I don't find it dirty. I don't describe it as laundry. I describe it as a condition of living. It runs through my family. There is not a day that goes through my life where I don't worry or don't think about the possibility of mental illness in my own two daughters. There is not a day that passes in my life when that concern doesn't arise to me. Is this a childhood tantrum, or is this the exposure of something that has run through my own family for decades? Is this a deviation from normal, or is it something that will suddenly manifest itself as an illness? So I wanted to divide my talk, it's going to be brief, into three things, three themes that run through the history of cancer, and what we can learn from that history and apply to the world of mental illness. When I was asked to give the talk, aside from being an enormous fan of Deepika's, the first question I asked myself is, why me? Why am I giving this talk? And then I quickly realized and understood why I was giving this talk, or why I was even intended to give this talk, and that is because there is a path that was created, forged forward by cancer medicine, by cancer biology, by cancer scientists, by doctors, and most importantly, by patients and advocates, that took a disease that was stuffed in the back of hospitals and made it the most prominent word in the history of illness. That took a disease that Fanny Rosenau could not publish in the New York Times to a place where you could not read the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Indian Express or the Hindustan Times or the Times of India without encountering the word cancer at least once in the front pages or the second page of the newspaper. What happened? What were those forces? And there were three forces, and to learn how to deploy them, to learn how to understand them, is a task that I think mental health professionals, mental health advocates, psychiatrists, neurologists, patients, us, need to understand today. The first force was political. And by political, I mean not just bureaucrats, not just politicians. I mean the entire body politic, which means the extension of everyone who was involved in policy making, regulatory decisions, thinking about how to create health or recreate health in the West and in the United States in particular. It's impossible to talk about this moment without talking about Mary Lasker. Mary Lasker was a visionary. Her own husband died of colon cancer. And in the wake of that death, Mary Lasker took on the job of launching or helping launch Nixon's so-called war on cancer. Now, we could disagree, agree, doesn't matter whether we like or dislike the metaphor of war in cancer, but nonetheless, it was Mary Lasker's effort that led to the incredibly important moment in the history of the United States when all of a sudden cancer became a word that was, again, no longer confined to the back of a hospital, but became the most prominent form of illness and a prominent battle that was a frontier of American health. It was likened several times, not once, but several times, like to landing on the moon. the cure or the treatment or the prevention of cancer was likened to the achievement of human beings landing on the moon, that created a kind of, that swept away decades of nihilism and stigma and allowed cancer doctors, cancer patients to really enforce and be empowered in creating a war on cancer. This led to an incredible series of policy changes or political changes in the United States, among which was the creation of a new National Cancer Institute. That institute, for the first time in the history of the United States, had membership not only from scientists and from physicians and obviously politicians, but was one of the first institutes to be funded where one of the leaders of the institutes were patients and patient advocates. Patient advocates led the institute. They led the idea that this was no longer a problem that was somehow confined in the academy or in politics, but this was a problem of urgency that needed to be brought out into the public and spoken about in the most public manner possible. I don't need to emphasize to this audience that we need this for mental health. We need for mental health a national institute. Of course, in the United States, this is run by the National Institutes of Mental Health, but we need a national institute where part of the institute is not just, of course, people who practice neuropsychiatry, people who care about patients with mental health issues, but of course, people who suffer the consequences of mental health, many of which are poorly understood. In other words, patients and patient advocates themselves. So this was the political sphere or the political background that changed or began to change in the 1960s and 70s in the United States and, to be honest, around the world. The second force or the second convergence was social. At the same time that Mary Lasker was moving the frontiers of mental health, of cancer, an enormous groundswell of advocacy was moving within society to destigmatize cancer and to move away from a model in which the cancer patient had somehow brought it on himself or herself. This idea of, oh, you bring the disease to yourself, you brought the disease to yourself, you are therefore a victim, you are therefore to blame for the disease, began to be erased. There are several names to be mentioned here. Many of them happen to be women because of the importance of breast cancer. I'm remembering people whose papers I've studied, people whose lectures I've studied, people who've become friends of mine even if they've passed away because I've been in their archives. Rose Kushner, Happy Rockefeller, Betty Ford, among all of them, who were the first to mention the words and remind us that there was no stigma around it, that there was no blame, there was no victimhood, but in fact they were ill, and their illness empowered them to be speakers about that illness itself. These social pressures were minor to start, but then began to spread like a contagion across the West and, of course, across the world. It's important to remember that we think about these social changes in retrospect as precursors or as really methods by which the community of patients who suffered from HIV/AIDS would then pick up these signals, they would understand these methods and ultimately apply them through social channels long before the invention of Facebook and Twitter, but through social channels to use for their own purposes to destigmatize and to ultimately move away from this victimhood model of HIV/AIDS. In fact, there was a very sweet moment in New York City where I live. I go to a gym which is across the street from St. Vincent's. I don't know how many people remember, but St. Vincent's was one of the first hospitals where most of these earliest patients with HIV/AIDS were hospitalized. I spoke to a man years ago, and he said, you know, we wouldn't walk down 7th Avenue because there were glass windows on St. Vincent's in the emergency room. And we wouldn't walk down 7th Avenue because when we walked down 7th Avenue and saw a friend of ours through the glass window, we knew he would be dead in 5 or 6 weeks. So we would walk across 7th Avenue, we would cross the street. Now that hospital has become an emergency room, been bought by another hospital, etc. There's a beautiful memorial outside it. And it was a sweet moment, or a bittersweet moment, when I saw 2 men. I was walking to my gym and I saw 2 men, and one of the men turned to the other man and he said, why is there an AIDS memorial here? Because we've forgotten that moment when the terror moved through the community. Of course, cancer was part of the symptomatology of AIDS, but we've forgotten that moment because we erased that social stigma, we erased that social history, we recreated history, we made it from scratch, we remolded another illness, borrowing from cancer, we remolded another illness away from victimhood, blame, and the terror into something where we could apply things that we're actually quite good at. Empathy, a desire to relieve suffering, and a want to cure and to treat. And that was we should be proud of these achievements. These are achievements that are just as great as landing on the moon. These are just as great as cracking an atom. They are just as great as inventing the internet. To take an illness that was stigmatized, laughed at, and converting that into things that we're good at. Empathy, love, affection, laughter, is just as great an achievement as landing a rocket on the moon or cracking an atom. So these were the social forces. The final set of forces were biological or genetic or, I would say, pharmaceutical to some extent. And these were efforts made by scientists, by physician scientists, by entrepreneurs, to take cancer and understand its molecular mechanism so that it would not become a source of victimhood, to understand why people get cancer. And the answers, again, emerged in the 1970s. The answers were quite clear. Cancer occurs because of mutations in cells. It doesn't occur because you have negative thinking. It doesn't occur because you happen to be a depressed human being. It has no relationship with whether you happen to have a particular personality or not. It occurs because you have mutations in cells. These mutations have 4 sources. They can either come from alterations in DNA because of carcinogens such as cigarette smoke, tobacco. You can inherit them. They can occur because viruses can cause them. And finally, they can occur by random chance. You can get them because you were randomly, when a cell divides, it can make a mistake. And when that mistake occurs, that mistake can lead to a mutation. These 4 set of choices, as it were, altered our understanding of what cancer was, away from a disease associated with melancholia, with black bile, with the idea of victimhood, and began to clarify the mechanisms by which cancers occur and how they can be treated. They led to the first generation of therapies, chemical therapies, chemotherapies, and finally have led to targeted therapies and immunotherapies. And I'm very proud to partner with Kiran to deliver the first set of cellular therapies, immunotherapies in India, which are so far not available. So these biological insights are now being extended into mental illness as well. The formula or the understanding of mental illness has changed. We now know, much like cancer, mental illness, much of mental illness is results from a cooperation of genetics and the environment. It is a very simple idea, and yet we never have swallowed it fully. Just to give you one example, schizophrenia, the disease that happens to run in my family, we now know that there are at least 100 genes, maybe more than 100 genes that contribute, gene variants that contribute to schizophrenia. And yet there's a clear role for the environment in this. In other words, if you're an identical twin, not every identical twin, when one has schizophrenia, the other twin will develop schizophrenia, although the frequency is much higher than the general population. So both these things are true. In other words, there is a clear genetic component to schizophrenia, but there's also some environmental factors that contribute to its release. There is clearly a genetic component to depression, although there are clearly environmental factors that contribute to its release. There are very clearly genetic components to virtually every mental illness, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorders, etc., but there are environmental components that contribute to their release. And the challenge for the next generation, much like the challenge for cancer, was to understand these two components, like you can understand the components of a machine, and understand what components of what genetic components can be predicted and perhaps treated, and what environmental components can be predicted and perhaps treated. And I have been an intense proponent, perhaps I would argue one of the earliest proponents, to say that these are a yin and yang puzzle. That if you solve the yin, which is the genetic component, the biologic component, you still have to solve the yang, which is the milieu or the social component in which these diseases are ultimately released. I had a very intense conversation with my daughter in which I asked her, my 13-year-old daughter, Leela, in which I asked her about this yin and yang quality. And she said to me something that is so perceptive that I will repeat it to you. She said, I said, Leela, do you feel anxious? And she said, yes, my anxiety is actually increasing over the years. And obviously this has deep resonances for me because of my family history and so forth. So I said, what are you anxious about? And she said, you know, Dad, social media tells us all about how to behave and how to be, but it doesn't tell me how to behave and how to be. It creates a sense of normalcy around what it means to behave and how to be in general. But in fact, when it creates that normalcy, it excludes my own sense of self. I don't know what to be. It tells me how other people are being, but I don't know what to be myself. It creates identity for other people, but it doesn't create identity for me. And when that happens, of course, when that mismatch happens, I get more anxious because I don't know how I'm supposed to behave. What is the nature of my behavior? So while much like cancer, we have solved many problems, but we've also introduced new carcinogens into our society. Cigarette smoke didn't exist, or smoking or tobacco. Lung cancer was unheard of as a disease in 1920. You'd have to look up a textbook and find a minor page on lung cancer. By 1990, lung cancer was a major killer both of men and women in the world and in the United States, among other diseases. By analogy, this particular anxiety around normal behavior, what is it like to be, what does identity mean, may or may not have been problems in the 1920s. It is a problem in 2019 because we're being constantly bombarded with the carcinogen of anxiety. And that carcinogen of anxiety has pervaded our culture, and we have to resist it, just like we resisted the carcinogens of cancer in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. So, in order to succeed in a mental health program in any country, these three forces, the political, the social, and the biologic, have to be allied with each other. They have to create a system or an ecology where these carcinogens, to use cross-language as it were, of anxiety and depression and other mental illness are not pervading our environment, but in fact we're recognizing them up front, recognizing the gene-environment interaction, and understanding how to decapitate them before they start. I will stop here and invite a conversation with Deepika, who has been incredibly open about her own history, about her own story, and there'll be many, many more stories to tell. And thank you very much. It's an honor. Deepika, which chair would you like? Okay, I prefer my right profile.
Over to both of you.
This is blocking our view. Okay, well, this is very easy to fix. Because we can either move this or move ourselves forward. How's that?
Thank you so much for that. First of all, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and doing our very first inaugural lecture series. For someone who's seen mental illness very, very closely, and you spoke about how the stigma towards cancer was actually led by lay people, in a sense. Where society sort of came together and helped bring it forward. How in India do you think that we stigmatize mental illness, and how do you think we can overcome that in the Indian context?
Well, I think you've done a lot yourself, Deepika, so I think, first of all, an important congratulations to you. You begin, I think, one begins all these journeys in a confessional mode. There are no patients, and this is an important thing to realize, there are no patients who are not people. The word patient is an abstraction. Humans, people are individuals. So you begin there. You begin by telling your story. I think of myself as a storyteller, not only as a scientist, but also as a physician, and also as a writer. You begin by telling the story. You begin by telling your story. You tell your story to your mother. You tell your story to your father. You tell your story to your children. You incite their stories. And these stories then begin to circulate across time and space. And you've done this yourself. So I think the first step is to create the safety and the security that comes with allowing yourself to tell your own story or other people's stories, and make it possible to tell that story without, as I said, blame and victimhood. That is the personal. But that personal agenda, that personal strategy, is only successful if it's supported broadly by social and political changes, as I described, and of course by biologic insights, by scientific insights. So as you tell that story, one finds oneself, you find yourself joined by other forces. You'll find allies everywhere. People you thought that didn't exist come out of the woodwork. and they begin to become your allies. They tell you that, gosh, you know, I've been working on this forever, and here's what I found. I found, you know, a physician might say, here are some patterns that I found. When take a disease or take an illness like postpartum depression, it was not even characterized as an illness several decades ago. The number of women who will experience postpartum depression, an illness that we do not understand, that will drive them towards near suicidality. Yeah, this is, in other words, 50% of the population of human beings, of which some 20-odd% have had a child, of which some 10% will experience a devastating illness that will drive them to suicidality, was not even listed in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is one of the fundamental journals or one of the fundamental Bibles of psychiatry, neuropsychiatry, until several decades ago, because no one spoke about it. Now there is a whole interest in what are the neurohormonal changes that accompany pregnancy and birth, and a biological understanding. If you go to any place on the planet, really, you will find other people, other women who've suffered from this disease, postpartum depression. You will find ways to cope, you will find ways to talk, you will find ways to communicate, and there is a vast biological enterprise that is trying to understand why these hormonal changes cause this terrible and devastating illness. So this is to say that all the solutions to all illnesses, the solutions to all problems occur in an ecosystem. And that ecosystem has to evolve. It takes time to evolve. And you've done a lot to push that ecosystem to evolve. It's up to the rest of us to help you along. You've told your story. We need to tell our stories to help you in evolving the ecosystem around it.
You've dealt very closely, obviously, with
Sorry. Can someone turn this hideous sound off?
because I'm freezing.
I'm freezing too. And also it's noisy. If it can't be done, it's okay, but we'll walk our way through it. But
You've worked very closely with cancer and with cancer patients. And is it safe to assume that emotionally and mentally that's something that there's emotional and mental turmoil that they go through as well? And what is done to sort of tackle that while, say, someone's experiencing cancer and going through therapy? And so what is the mental state of that person at that time?
well, it varies a lot. Some people come into the clinic, you know, thinking of themselves as fighters and soldiers. Others are more resigned. There's a big variation, of course, in people. One of the reasons that doctors are doctors is that we treat human beings as individuals and not as collectives or as abstractions. There's a big variation. But the reality is that cancer is a terrifying diagnosis across the board, and understanding and empathizing with patients individually takes a separate set of skills. It takes a set of skills that are developed over time. You have to learn how to do it. There is no one-size-fits-all model, much like there is not in neuropsychiatry. And one of the great things we've learned over time is that people have very different approaches. Some people are resigned, some people want the most aggressive therapy, and you have to create a kind of bond with them. I call it an atomic bond, because the relationship between an individual and their oncologist is extraordinarily close. In fact, the only other mirror for this, ironically, or perhaps not ironically, is a relationship between a patient and his or her psychiatrist. there is that same kind of atomic bond that exists, and it will never go away. It never goes away if you find the right person. So, treating a cancer patient involves obviously not just the medical therapy, the surgical and oncological chemotherapy that accompanies, but we are now increasingly reliant on psychiatry, psycho-oncology, palliative care, and other disciplines to help us with patients with cancer.
Okay. Which leads me to my next question, which was particularly in India, and we at the Live Love Laugh Foundation believe that general practitioners really are the first line of defense when it comes to mental illness, because with people struggling with mental illness, a lot of the symptoms are physical symptoms. Why is it then that sort of correlation between physical and mental health is often overlooked? So say if I go to a general practitioner with a stomach bug or any other physical symptom, he's most often going to try and treat me for that, versus trying to find the correlation between my mental health and physical health. Why do you think that happens, and what do you think we can do in India to sort of overcome that challenge?
Well, I think it's a historical challenge, and the challenge arises from a very biomedical model of health. If you look at the history of the brain broadly, that history can be divided into two camps. One camp is a camp of people who originated historically with the belief that the brain is a series of wires and a series of circuits. These were the electrophysiologists. And then there's a second group of people who believe that the brain is a mush of chemicals. These were the chemical scientists. And for decades, the field of psychiatry and the field of neuropsychiatry has struggled between these two models of the brain. Of course, both are correct. The brain is simultaneously a series of electrical circuits, but also a mush of chemicals that is influenced by the rest of the body. More recently, a sort of third wave has emerged, appropriately, which says that the brain is integrated with the rest of the body. That it's not separate, it's not a blob of gray matter sitting in a box that happens to be your skull, but in fact is highly integrated with the rest of your body, and that illnesses that affect one part of your body ultimately feed back to the brain, and the brain ultimately feeds back to the rest of these illnesses. It is a tougher model because it's more integrative. It acquires, thank you, it acquires it acquires insights from ecology, it acquires insights from physiology, from neurophysiology, and ultimately asks questions that are very deep questions, which is, what is the relationship between the brain and the intestines, the brain and other organs? What is the phenomenon? What does the phenomenon of depression look like in terms of an organismal illness? Not just as a bog of chemicals in your brain. What does the phenomenon of depression look like as an organismal illness? Why is it, for instance, that people who are severely depressed and have deep organic depression often find organic symptoms in their bodies? They can't eat. Or people who are anxious can't have the physiology they have all sorts of problems with, among other things, cardiac disease. So these relations were ignored for a long time, but have now come to light as we have moved away from this sort of brain as a box of chemicals or a brain as a box of wires idea. This will take time. It requires a lot of sophistication. It requires systems biology. It requires a systems analytic way of thinking. But just to finish up, it's really important to get insights from both physicians and from patients. Because patients will tell you. Patients will tell you what their symptoms are. You can decide not to record them. You can decide not to write them. But they will tell you what their symptoms are. They will tell you, gosh, I'm depressed and I have digestive symptoms. And you can say, God, I'm going to just ignore the digestive symptoms and pretend that your brain's a little box in a skull. Patients with cancer will tell you, I mean, this is a classic example. This has been going on for decades. Patients with pancreatic cancer will tell you that they have depression, severe intractable depression. We have known this for decades. I've treated dozens of patients with pancreatic cancer. They will tell you I have severe intractable depression and it preceded my diagnosis with pancreatic cancer. I have no idea why. No one knows why. There is a neurohormonal circuit, I suspect, that creates this kind of prodrome of depression with pancreatic cancer. I don't know why. It's not true for other cancers. It's uniquely true for pancreatic cancer. We can decide not to record it. I wrote a long piece on this for the New York Times Magazine. We can choose to ignore it and push it away. But it's real. Patients are telling you this. They're coming to your office and saying, you know, Dr. Mukherjee, long before I was diagnosed, I had a prodrome in which I felt profoundly depressed and I didn't know why. And you can say, gosh, I'm just going to write that away. Or you can say, you know, that's a matter of, this is something that reason can solve, that science can solve. Anyway, that's a long answer to your question. But the way to move forward is to really apply a more integrative model to all of these sciences.
What do you do for your mental health? Or what do doctors do for their mental health? And I think considering globally and in India, and globally especially, we see it everywhere, the high rate of burnout amongst professionals. Do people find the time? What do they do for their mental health?
Well, I can tell you what I do for mental health because I sag. I have a very particular pattern. So I sag by the end of the day. By the end of every day of my practice, I sag. And the clouds come very clearly at about 5 to 6 p.m. I have a seasonal affective disorder as well. I've done everything. I have a lamp in my room, I have etc. But what really helps, I have to say, is exercise. So I try to run. And that is one thing I do. And the second thing is I spend the evening, usually, with scientists in my laboratory and with my family, describing my day. And often, I have no fear of crying, by the way. Often it will end in tears. I'm not afraid of it. I don't think it's, you know, there is I have no fear of the, of masculinity in crying. And I will say I had a really hard day. You know, I saw a 40-year-old woman who was about to die. I tried to administer palliative care. I failed. My trial failed. You know, this failed. My credit card didn't work. The treadmill was broken. And, you know, it was a horrible day. So I think the capacity to look inside, to look inwards, and not to create a painted face. And this goes back to this problem that my daughter had identified. The number of painted faces has increased so dramatically in our society that we can't tell our real face anymore. We don't know what the real face looks like. Everyone's face is painted. And so the capacity to come back to friends, to family, to people who you love, people who you have a connection with, and to say, this is not the painted face, this is the real face. I think is a powerful, for me, a powerful antidepressant. It is a powerful mode to rid myself of anxiety. It doesn't do everything. This is just to remind ourselves that I'm a big believer in psychopharmacology. Medicines help. If you are in the place that you need medicines, they do help. Seek help. In cancer, just to create the analogy, you can't wish the cancer away. You can't say, go, I'm going to wish the cancer away. The purpose of medicine is to help. And I'm a big psychopharmacology, by that I mean psychiatric medicines for anxiety and depression are not ideal. We have not invented the best medicines that we would like to invent with the least amount of side effects. But if you're in that situation that you need professional help, don't be ashamed. Seek professional help and seek medicines. There is no stigma. There is no problem. Maybe it won't work for you, but medicines help.
Yeah. Thank you. Do you think funding is essential? I think funding played a very essential role in where cancer is today in terms of research, in terms of awareness, in terms of cure. Where do you see funding for mental health going? What stage do you think we're at? How do you think we can better that? And how do you think it can obviously benefit the cause?
Look, I mean, money always helps. There is no doubt about it. I mean, to some extent, research is labor. Labor is driven by money. The capacity to attract the most brilliant men and women who will make a change depends on us being able to provide them with the resources.
How did cancer go about doing that?
So what happened was it was a slow release, as it were. The war on cancer helped. The campaign against cancer has helped. They were extraordinarily helpful. The budget of the National Institutes of Health has a budget of $50 billion now. Now that sounds like a big number, but just to contrast it, it is a fraction of a fraction of what the Iraq war cost, which was several $1 trillion. So researchers survive on a budget of, fundamental researchers working in academic hospitals survive on a budget of about $50-odd billion, of which the National Cancer Institute in the United States takes about 15 to 20 billion. It's one of the largest chunks of that. It's supplemented by philanthropy. It's supplemented, of course, by other sources of money. The National Institute of Mental Health has now increased its budget and has continued to increase its budget. So, of course, I think money helps. I think it has helped all along. I think the money is driven by public interest. If you want increased interest in mental health, if you want increased attention to mental health, the way to do this is to fund more and more in-depth research on mental health. That has to be a public enterprise. The National Institutes of Health, the National Institute of Mental Health in the world, in the country, in India, don't arise out of the vacuum. Right. They are mandates created by the voting public. It's your tax dollars, as it were, or tax rupees, as it were, that are contributing to these institutes. These institutes then have these as mechanisms to fund in-depth research. And that in-depth research ultimately translates, in the perfect world, translates into medicines for human health. You will never hear from me that any illness is overfunded. And you will certainly not hear from me that illnesses such as depression, schizophrenia, postpartum depression, anxiety are overfunded. They're chronically underfunded.
And finally, what would you say to all of us at the Live, Love, Love Foundation that wake up every morning and work towards giving hope to those struggling with stress, anxiety, and depression? What would you say to us, and where would you like to see us, say 5, 10 years from now?
Well, I would like to see I would like to see very much. I would like to see the foundation making deep inroads into all aspects of society in India. You know, the public advertising campaigns are one start, but you have recognized, and all of us have recognized, the depth of the problem. It is compounded by discrimination across gender and sexual orientation. Those are extraordinary problems, and they are endemic problems. These problems, in other words, the burden of mental health and the burden of taking care of people with mental health falls, we know this from large statistical surveys, on women disproportionately on women. And then they become burdened with mental health issues themselves. So this is not to say that men don't suffer from mental health problems, but the disproportionate burden of taking care of children and adults with mental health issues in this country and in countries across the world fall disproportionately on women. I would like very much to see a women's health program within the mental health practice. I would like to see that initiated by you. I would like to see that funded by the government. I would like to see central input on that. I would like to see that program succeed. I would like to see that program succeed in rural India. I would like to see that program. I'm just setting out your challenges,
Yep.
and I'll call you in
That's fine.
5 years. I'll call you in 5 years.
I mean, we can disagree as well, and we can be on a completely different path, but the inputs are most welcome.
Yes, you can disagree, but you would be wrong. But no, but look, we have to agree on some things, and that is that the burdens are disproportionately fall on one gender, so I would like to see a specific program, a directed program on women's mental health, which you've already launched, I know, and there's lots of interest. And I would like to see this as part of a global health program, which you integrate into, because the lessons learned from India are applicable to wherever you want in the world, all from, you know, Appalachia in the United States to Mali in Africa to Greenland in which we were going to buy at some point in time, but are really applicable. So I would like to see this program flourish, but in particular, I would like to see a particular focus on those who bear the deepest burdens of mental health.
Thank you.
That was a very lovely conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee and Deepika. That was really quite a wonderful conversation. Please air our dirty laundry of mental illness anytime. Continue to remain seated, please. I'd now like to request the audience to raise your hands, ask questions, identify yourself. Keep your questions short and no comments, just questions. Yes. Mr. Dave. The mic will just get to you, yes.
That was very eye-opening, Dr. Mukherjee. I'm a lawyer, and I really didn't understand anything of this till this evening. So thank you very much. I have a question. You said, and as I understood, maybe I understood it wrong, but most of the causes for mental challenges are physical. I mean genetic, as you said. But I feel that how far is society contributing to that? For example, violence, fear, domestic violence, violence against women. You know, when you read, or even industrialization, when you read authors like Furukawa in Japan, for example, you find that the Japanese society is intensively depressive today. I mean, each of his stories, short stories, reflect that kind of a situation. So how far is that, really contributing to mental health challenges across the world, and especially in countries like India?
Well, so just to be clear about what I said, I don't think that the problems are genetic alone, or biologic alone, I should rather say, but these are gene-environment interactions. In the language and the jargon of biology, we call it GXE, or G multiplied by E, genes and environment collaborating together to create illness. I think no real biologist, no real scientist, no physician, no advocate, no patient believes that mental health or cancer or any of the other illnesses are genetic alone. The genetics or biology, I shouldn't even say genetics, biology creates a platform or a trigger, but you need the gun to activate or actualize that trigger. This has been a largely uniform understanding of illness across many diseases. There are some exceptions. There are some exceptions in which the contribution of genetics is so strong that despite environments, the biology exerts itself. To give you some examples, those would be, and even those are hard to find. Whether you're born in one place or another, if you inherit two mutations in the sickle cell gene, you will have sickle cell anemia. That can be modified by other genes, but ultimately your cells will sickle and you will be anemic. That is a powerfully genetic disease, a single gene, monogenetic disease, where there's a very, very little gene-environment interaction. Most common human diseases are not like that, don't behave like that. And those include anxiety, depression, stress, cancer, hypertension, cardiac disease, etc. Most common human illnesses, we now know, are the result of probably hundreds, if not tens of hundreds of gene variants. And most of them are modifiable or modified by the environment. As I said, there are certain exceptions on both sides and most mental illness we now know from very detailed studies. These are not sort of soft studies, these are very hard studies. For instance, by studying identical twins that were reared apart and asking the question, if they have the identical genetics but they were in very different circumstances, did they have the same illness? Based on these kinds of studies, we know that many mental illnesses have a genetic component. It's quite a powerful genetic component. We can quantify it, but it is not an absolute genetic component. So there are identical twins, for instance, who have the same genetics, one of whom is schizophrenic and the other one is not schizophrenic. So to dive down a little bit more, if you take a disease like schizophrenia, the chances for one identical twin reared apart to also have schizophrenia, so they were separated at childhood, brought up by different parents. If they have the severest form of schizophrenia, the chances are about 0.8. So in other words, 80% of the time, both of the children will have schizophrenia of some form or the other. That points to the powerfulness or the power of the genetic component of that disease. With dyslexia, that number is also around 0.8, something like that. With anxiety, it actually reduces quite a lot. With depression, it reduces quite a lot. And with other illnesses, it reduces quite substantially. So there's a spectrum in which the component of the genetic component and the environmental or social component can be dissociated. These are hard studies to do, but have been done with most forms of illness. And so we can actually quantify the contribution of the biologic component of the disease and the environmental component of the disease. Deepika, do you have anything to add to that? I mean, you have some experience about the...
Well, I obviously can't, I mean, I wouldn't know as much, but I think various factors, I think in short, I think various factors contribute to that. And my limited understanding tells me that it's biological, but it's also, you know, with all the external factors. And I think that with someone who's experienced depression, I think you need to work today, I need to work at it every day to sort of keep it at bay and not sort of have those episodes again. So it's a constant sort of working on yourself to make sure that it doesn't happen again.
So tell us what you do. I mean, I told you what I do. Tell us what you do.
What do I do?
Smile.
I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I'm an actor.
A wife.
I'm a wife. Oh God, I forgot. And I shared my story about anxiety and depression, set up the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation that works towards destigmatizing and creating awareness, specifically with anxiety and depression, and yeah, occasionally act in movies.
Yeah, Dr. Roy.
Thanks very much. I must say that your work is absolutely amazing, and your talk today was wonderful. I must say I was particularly moved by what your daughter said. As a media person, it really affected me, and it gave us a lot to think about. And in your analysis over the last 33, 4, 5 decades, what has the positive role that media, what is the positive role that media can play? And today, both traditional and new social media, what can we do?
Well, I think, you know, I think we've seen both the power of social media and the ills of social media brought out. When, you know, when social media first emerged in the late 1990s, early 2000s, we thought it would be the great connector. And it has certainly done that. It has been a great connector. It has allowed people whose voices were previously unheard to enter a global conversation. This has been a wonderful thing. On the other hand, like all human practices, not only has it been a great connector, it has also been a great normalizer. And the normalization of humans is not necessarily always a good thing, because it enforces a certain kind of behavior, it forces a certain kind of what is considered normal. And in fact, has excluded as much as it has included. We had imagined, I think falsely, that social media was only about inclusion. But it has turned out to be as much about exclusion as about inclusion. It would have, I think that it was a particularly idiotic reading of history to imagine that a community of networked individuals, that if you opened up the community of networked individuals, that all you would get is inclusion. You would need to read Orwell once to know that would not be the case. That in fact what would happen as a result of this vast network of individuals would be as much exclusion and as inclusion, or that it would be as much a force of as my daughter said to me very movingly, that, you know, it's so easy for me to find the identity of everyone else. I just can't find my own identity in all of this. You would have to be a particularly you'd have to be particularly ignorant of human history and writing about human nature and behavior to not suspect, sorry, that was a double negative, but to not suspect that this would be an inevitable result of the connection between individuals in the world. That in fact, on one hand, we would bring new voices into the conversation. But by bringing new voices into the conversation, we would also necessarily push away certain kinds of voices that were in the conversation.
So what should we do and not do as media?
What should we do and not do? I think we should, I think we're at a kind of crossroads. We've seen this crossroads now across very personal and political spectra. So in a very political realm, we've seen how governments and how organizations and organizational bodies have twisted social media for very nefarious purposes. We've also seen the power of advocacy across social media. So what should we do? We should read and read more. We should know what the dangers are, because going into this blindly is to be, but as I said, particularly stupid about history. I will tell you a nice story. I told my daughter, this is another story about my daughter. I said, my daughter wanted a cell phone. This was 2 years ago. And she, my older daughter, Leela, wanted a cell phone. I said, this was 2 summers ago. I said, Leela, you can have a cell phone under the following conditions: that you will read Animal Farm and 1984. And we will have a discussion about those 2 books. And once we finish that discussion, you can have a cell phone. Now, this is a silly example, but it is a real example, because I knew, and you know, and we know what the power of what the power and the persuasive power of groupthink is, and that persuasive power destroys creativity. It is a malignant source of the end of individual think. That is why it's called groupthink. And so what should we do? I'm not a policy person, but what should we do is we should revisit those lessons and try to limit as much as we can the persuasive powers of groupthink that come from social media. I mean, maybe you have some recommendations that are very practical or pragmatic. What I do is, this is one of my favorite things, is to ask the person who's asking the question back. Because they usually know the answers better than I do.
Watch NDTV.
Exactly. So, Pranay, what would you do? What would you do? No, tell us what this is a conversation. This is not what would you do? Tell us some things that you would do to prevent the anxiety and the groupthink and the depression and the things that come out of the emergence of pervasive social media. What would you do?
This is the most unfair thing you've ever done, actually. I'm just an anchor. I ask questions. I never think, so no answers. No, I just really want to know how, as the media, we can help.
Yeah. I think what he does is use truthful news coverage.
Yes.
That's what he does.
So it's a sane voice in a mad world.
Yeah. Barkha, are you here? She's left the building.
Yes,
Okay.
I think that gentleman there has a question. Yes. Could you have the mic over to him, please? That gentleman there. Yes. You asked a question?
I had a question.
Please do identify yourself. Sir.
My name is Sanjay Sachdev, and I had a question with Siddharth. You mentioned that cancer occurs because of genetic mutations. In 2017, there was a clear linkage in the British, the NHS published some data that 8% of the colorectal cancers that were there were linked to depression and anxiety. And that was trying to establish a clear linkage between stress, anxiety, and the inflammation caused by depression to cancer. Just want to understand how that links with that.
Yeah, just to clarify, I mean, those studies are correlative studies and not causative studies, right? So a correlation is not a cause. Many things are correlated with each other. I told you, depression, I don't think depression causes pancreatic cancer. I think it is correlated with pancreatic cancer because of a neurohormonal axis that we still don't understand or we don't know. But I think that there are some links that we still need to explore, which is that we have now begun to deepen our understanding of metabolic states, immunological states, where you can expose or increase your risk of cancer. This is really an understanding in its infancy. I would say 10 years ago, I would have stated quite categorically that we knew so little about these so-called neurohormonal states that it was not worth really even talking about in public. About a decade later, we have now found that these correlations are strong for particular cancers, and we have started to explore them a little bit more deeply. That is really all we know. We don't know if, in fact, there is some correlation. In other words, both of them are arising from some common event, or whether one causes the other. And this is in fact, the NHS has launched a big study. The NIH has launched a big study to figure out whether these are causal. In other words, if your mental state is causal of some kind of cancer, or whether these are just two heads, as it were, of the same hydra that are related at the same level but are not causing each other.
Yes, that lady there? Yeah, sorry. Neelam? I'll come to you in a minute. Neelam.
Yeah, hello, I'm Neelam, and I work with disability and inclusion. We have a center in Gurgaon. So I just want to tell you there's difference between haves and have-nots.
Yeah.
Because here we are talking about mental health and all that. We work with children with disabilities, and we work with children from underprivileged background, children and adults. So what we feel is they don't even get to see a doctor as a whole, and even to get a disability certificate for that matter. So in the field of disability, mental health is also one of the issues, and we have children with multiple disabilities. We have a school which is up to class 8, we have a vocational center, we work in the rural areas. So in one of the government programs, it was called caregivers training. So it was for people with disability, and they are very basic training which happens, and people get to have caretakers. So similarly, I just wanted to ask you, Deepika, because mental health and the challenges and schizophrenic and women with disability, and especially the mothers, most of the time we see men walk away, they have a lot of work, and they cannot take the stress, and women take the stress, mothers take the stress. So there is no question of getting a counselor or some mental health help. So can we also start some short courses where we can give them support?
I think that's something that we're definitely looking at doing, which is support groups. Yeah. So I think definitely in the next couple of years, you'll see us as a foundation working towards that as well, because we truly believe that unless we do it together as caregivers and as people like us, so like Siddhartha mentioned in cancer as well, so unless lay people come together and champion the cause and take that forward, it isn't going to happen. So doing it with the help of support groups is most certainly on the agenda.
Yeah, so we are ready.
Yes. Shakti Sinha, yes. Mic to him, please.
Thank you. We will ask a question to Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you for Deepika Padukone for making mental health normal, normalizing it. Anna, Dr. Bhatt may not remember me. Thank you for being there when I wanted you. My question to Dr. Mukherjee is, having lost 2 members of my family to cancer, is the fact that the standard response of doctors even today is chemo, radio. Standard response. I met somebody who's 85
I didn't hear you.
Chemo and radiotherapy.
The standard
Chemo and radiotherapy, I see. Yeah.
The standard response. I met somebody whose 85-year-old father has cancer of the gut. Doctor said, okay, 2 hours to operate, 6 rounds of chemo, 36 rounds of radio. And I told, can you let your 84-year-old father just live his life normally? Take care of him. But doctors insisted, and he came back very happy. Sir, ho gaya, sab ho gaya. And my heart sank. What does it take for the medical profession to get over this?
Well, look, you know, the medical profession has been getting over this for a while. It's not an easy thing to get over because we want to help treat and cure patients. It took, you can read, there was I should say that there's a reason that this, if you look at the chapters of my book, of Emperor of All Maladies, palliative oncology is the center of the book. And it's the center of the book for a reason. It sits in the middle of the book for a reason because of exactly this. We fought so hard that we forgot what it was like to have dignity in fighting. And this is a historical coincidence, an accident, a reality. In the new class of fellows and in the new class of doctors, I've seen a real resurgence in the ability to understand palliative care. We withdrew care from my own father at a point of time when everyone was in the middle of the fight. My sister and I and my mother and my uncle, we decided to withdraw care. And I have to say, I was incredibly thankful. I'll tell you 2 stories, both of which are quite moving. One is that, you know, my father enjoyed and set up Durga Puja. And it was Durga Puja season. So he was at AIMS, really declining from neurological issues. So we decided that on the day of, the main day of the puja, Ashtami, that we would smuggle him out of the hospital. So because we asked the doctors, and the doctor said, under no circumstances whatsoever are you to move him from the hospital. So my cousin and I, my nephew and I hatched a plan. We said, fine, yeah, of course, we'll never move him out of the hospital. But we smuggled in a wheelchair. And we propped him up on the wheelchair. And we put a makeshift IV bag, because he needed fluids. We put a makeshift IV bag, and we brought him to we asked the puja committee, and we said, listen, can you clear out the space for just 20 minutes? And we were driving, we drove him in this car. We drove him to the puja, and my brother-in-law, who's the ambassador, was then the ambassador to Egypt. We were stuck for a while because there was a thela in the road. So I told my brother-in-law, who's the ambassador, I said, get out of the car and move the thela. So he moved the thela, and we got my father for 20 minutes, and it was the most blessed 20 minutes of his life. And then we came back, we smuggled him back, put up his IVs, and we pretended that nothing had happened. Then 5 days, 6 days later, I went to the doctor. He was at AIMS. He was a neurologist, and he was a geriatrician. And I said, look, man, you and I can speak honestly. I said, this is going nowhere. It's going nowhere fast. So let's have an honest conversation. He said, but in India, there is no euthanasia. I said, do you think I'm trying to euthanize my father? I'm not trying to euthanize my father. I'm just trying to bring him home. So I said, look, let's have an honest conversation. And I said, let's not have a conversation doctor to doctor. You can use complicated terminology, and I'm an oncologist. I can double down on your complicated terminology. I can give you 10 times more complicated terminology. Let's speak as human beings. And I said, he's going nowhere. You know that.
I know that. Let him go home. And he was a human being. He said, fine, you know what? I'll sign a certificate and let him go home. And he let him go home. My father passed away in 3 days in his own bed. He was just waiting to go home. So it's complicated. It's not easy, because if you have this sense that everyone should go home, no one should get therapy, you become a nihilist. And you lose the practice of medicine. On the other hand, if you say to yourself that no one should go home, everyone should stay in the hospital, you become an enemy of human beings. The truth is somewhere in between, and like all truths, it depends on human beings to discover it. You know, I remember the famous quote of Gandhiji, who said in a very famous episode, he said, when he had been arrested for all his political activism, he said, I know I've caused you a lot of political trouble. I'm paraphrasing. I know I've caused you a lot of political trouble, but I'd like to speak to you as a man. And in the end, it is that truth that lies between the very complexities of medicine. You don't want to give up on everyone, because that would be very nihilistic. We wouldn't have started our CAR T company, our T-cell company, because all these children are terminally ill. They were terminally ill 4 years ago, 5 years ago. They have been recovered from the dead. There's a girl who's now 13 years old, Emily Whitehead, who I met. I wrote about her in a recent New Yorker piece. She was terminally ill. You could have gone to her doctors and said, why are we torturing this 13-year-old kid? She was then 8. Why are we torturing this 8-year-old kid? Why don't we let her go home? But the experimental therapeutics group at Penn and other places said, no, we really, really think we can solve it. And they gave her experimental therapy, fully alive today in a full remission. So I don't believe in the total nihilism of saying, oh, stop all chemo, radiation, experimental therapy. That would be giving up. It would be a complete nihilism. And this is the same thing that applies to mental health, right? You don't want to be the person who said, because there is something important in trying. We're trying to help people. I really genuinely want people to live long, dignified lives. But on the other hand, you don't want to assault the dignity of a human being. And that's where the art of medicine lives. And that's why it's called not the science of medicine, but the art of medicine.
I think that's all going to make us cry now. We'll be crying like you at the end of a long day. But really, that was a really moving story. And I think all of us, if we have the courage to tell our stories and to give each other and ourselves the dignity of life and death, I think that would be tremendous. Just one last question, that lady there, and then I will let you two go. Yes.
Thank you so much. My name is Anjana Bhushan. I work with the World Health Organization. I wanted to thank both of you. It was a very, very interesting conversation. And Deepika for starting this initiative and coming out. You may know that next month, every year, WHO observes World Mental Health Day, and that's coming right up. So this is a very topical, a very timely moment to start your series. And I was struck by the parallels that you drew, Dr. Mukherjee, in the movement, how the cancer movement built up, the cancer support movement, and where we are with the mental health movement right now. And I do think that many of the problems, the underfunding, the lack of research, the lack of providers, etc., the lack of priority, come from this fact of the stigma, which is what you've zeroed in on, Deepika, to fight, to make your contribution. And so I guess my question to you would be, and it's to Deepika actually, is you're a prominent celebrity, you're well recognized, and there's a lot of power in hearing you talk about your experience, because that really straight away cuts the stigma. You're people that everyone, you're someone that everyone recognizes. And I think that at this moment in time, you're like one voice. There are not enough voices. We need the critical mass. You're in a place where, and also with Prannoy Roy's question, with the partnership with the media, where we can get a lot of public people building that critical mass. And my question to you is, through the foundation, what has been your experience within your own industry? Are you seeing, as Dr. Mukherjee was saying, the allies popping up with their stories? Would you see sort of in a year or two this kind of critical mass building within your industry and other public walks of life where you see a lot of celebritydom?
Yes, I think 4 years ago, I don't think anyone reported anything on mental health. I don't think we were familiar with the word depression. I don't think we were familiar with, leave alone using these terms, but I don't even think we were comfortable about talking to our friends or our family about how we're feeling emotionally. We'd probably talk to them about how we feel physically. You have a fever, you have a cold. But if you were not feeling too good emotionally, I don't think we'd really talk about that. So most certainly, I think in the last 4 years, as a nation, we've come a long way in having that conversation, bringing that conversation to the fore. We've had many more people come out and speak about their own experiences. But what I do not want to do is to make this, about industry. And I think the way we view it is to say, I think the conversation has begun. I think we're in a good place. Most certainly, we have a long way to go. But yes, have people in a place of influence spoken out? Yes, they have. People who are in a place where they can shape and change the narrative? Yes, they have, not just in India, but globally as well. And then you have people who may not be in that sort of position, but I think in their own little way, I'm sure they are bringing about some change. Nothing makes me happier when I step out every day and there's a young girl or a young boy or someone who comes up to me and says that they've read an interview or heard about my experience and sought help, or their parents understood what they were going through. That was truly the intention of doing what I did. And I feel like there's nothing more rewarding than that. So I think people use that in different ways. I think some people in some ways influence a much larger audience. Some people probably do it in a much smaller gathering. But I think that momentum in whatever shape and size and form is important to take this conversation forward.
Thank you. Thank you for beginning the conversation, and I think it's up to us now to keep on with it. Thank you. You've been very good, both of you.
Thank you.
A huge round of applause. Yeah, may we continue to talk. Okay, thank you, both of you. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the conclusion of the formal proceedings for the evening. But before we go on, I would like to invite Anisha Padukone, director of the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation, and the one person who's been working tirelessly behind the scenes, very quietly, but she's really put this event together. Please, big round of applause.
Thank you, Kaveri. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to acknowledge and thank the many individuals and organizations for their contribution in making this evening possible and making it the success that it has been. First and foremost, my thanks to our Union Minister for Health and Family Welfare, Dr. Harshvardhanji, for his special message via video that he kindly took the time off to send us. His words of encouragement are great motivation to us in our journey. I would also like to thank Dr. Indu Bhushan, CEO of Ayushman Bharat, Mr. Amitabh Kant, the CEO of Niti Aayog, Dr. Renu Swarup, Secretary, Department of Biotechnology, and Dr. Balram Bhargava, the Director General of Indian Council of Medical Research. Professor Gagandeep Kang as well, Executive Director of the Translational Health Sciences and Technology Institute. Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Government of India. And Mr. Shakti Sinha, Director, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, for your presence this evening. We look forward to your support and contribution in the years ahead as we continue to expand our work. On behalf of Deepika, the trustees, and the entire team at the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation, my gratitude to Dr. Mukherjee for accepting our invitation to this inaugural lecture and making the long trip from the US and sharing his insights and perspective. Thank you, Dr. Mukherjee. I would like to request Anna Chandy, the chairperson of our foundation, to please step forward so that we can hand over a token of appreciation. I would also like to request Anna to hand over a token of our appreciation to Kaveri for helping us curate this event and for all your inputs and planning. My thanks also goes out to all the other distinguished guests this evening from the government, sponsors, Taj Mahal, our hospitality sponsor, Tissot, Asian Paints, Code Silver, and Easy Diner Prime. We've also had other partners who've helped us put this evening together. Naina and her team at Talking Point Communications. Prabhat and team at Spice. And Arun, Vineet, and Raja from Spring Marketing. Thank you also to Kanan and Namita and the team at WIP for your support in putting this event together. And last but not the least, my wonderful team at the Live, Love, Laugh Foundation. We started planning this in January, and here we are. So it's been a good journey. Thank you, one and all. I hope you continue to have a pleasant evening. Deepika, the trustees, and the team, as well as myself, look forward to interacting with you over dinner, and we look forward to your continued support so that we can all work together to inspire hope for the millions who are affected by stress, anxiety, and depression.
And a special thank you to the parents of the two beautiful Padukones here. Where are they? So always quietly at the back. The wonderful Prakash. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, your presence here demonstrates your willingness and commitment to be part of the solution to the mental health crisis that confronts us all. For those of you who were able to participate in the photo call as we started, please do collect your pictures as you exit the hall after dinner. That's not as yet. I would like to remind you to fill in details on the cards that are placed on your tables, where you can indicate how you would like to partner with the foundation in the months and years ahead. Yes, I hope it's the start of a beautiful relationship. It would be great if you could hand this over to any member of the foundation team. You will find us wearing these badges right here. And And really enjoy yourselves. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. You can all give yourselves a pat on the back. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Anisha and Deepika.